lot of obstacles that were our own fault. We just didn't know the system, right? And Alex was able to really teach us how to get to that quickly, which is great. Transportation is a big world.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a degree, and I grew up in outside of Pittsburgh, and I have a degree in education, so social studies, history, dual major type thing. And I drank the Kool-Aid quite literally when I was, gosh, like I think 15, and I started working for a family bus company, and I cleaned school buses in the summer and motor coaches late at night, that type of thing.
Right.
And never my wildest dreams. I was, well, I'm going to go to college, become a teacher, and I stuck to transportation early on. I never got out of it. So
It's a great field. It's a great field.
It is.
And it's one of those forever fields, right? I noticed when I was working with states that everybody liked the DOT, the state highway guys. The emergency managers, so the Homeland Security guys, nobody liked them, right? And I laughed because a lot of those were my board members. I'm like, what's the deal with this, right? And Johnny come lately, and all that stuff after 9/11 was ironed out. But
even when I was at F1CSA as a contractor, they were the enemies, so to speak, is to work for a motor carrier, but to work for them and be an auditor and actually being there and try and train and teach. And so I'm teaching in a way. My degree is not my money spent on a University of Pittsburgh degree is entirely
Right.
wasted. Other than hanging on my wall behind me, it wasn't. But it's nice to kind of say they're not that bad people. They're there to help you.
Yeah,
we've had a great working relationship with them too.
Yeah. So. Well, and I think like every agency, they go through cycles.
Yes. It certainly wasn't the relationship like ATA has now with FMCSA. That certainly hasn't been there. I mean, gosh, even in the last beyond 5 years, it was a rocky relationship. So
interesting. Yeah. What changed it from your perspective?
It's always with the administrator, and we've nothing against past administrators, but when Ray Martinez came on board, I mean, we just had a great working relationship with him, and even with Jim Mullen now, it's been fantastic. And I think there's really the overall willingness to listen and want to be helpful to industry and not the enforcement arm of we're going to catch you for doing something wrong. So
right.
And even you'll hear from drivers for them to know, top officials at FMCS, and that speaks a lot. And their outreach, their image, their campaign, everything like that.
I think you nailed it. I've even noticed that. I mean, I've been around it. It's my 16th year. I've even noticed it where I think enough storms, enough things have transpired that really have brought public-private together more so.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as adversarial as it used to be.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
I mean, there's still that component, but I think the people it's just maturing. It's a natural process, right? As a group, as organizations. And I think it's great. Especially if they can solve problems together, everybody wins.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, we have
I hate to interrupt, but it's 4:29, and I'm afraid that Tom Farmer may be signed in as a participant. Oh, wait, there he is.
There he is.
We also don't have Alex. So as soon as Tom gets connected, let's broadcast and see if he's in there.
Right, I'll watch for Alex.
Thank you.
Okay.
Get him connected here.
By the way, Tom is a big baseball fan, as you can probably tell.
I can tell.
What team is that? I'm trying to figure it out.
And New York, I think. NY? I can't tell. His logo looks like NY.
It looks like NY. It doesn't look like your typical.
Oh, Yankees hat.
Yankees? You can tell if those Yankees or Mets.
Anyway, Tom.
When we do this, let's broadcast, Tom, and then we just to say hi to everybody who might be on the line and let them upload. So going live in 4, 3, 2, 1. Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. We're just going to start in about a minute. We're still waiting for another one of our panelists to show up. but glad that you're here. Hey, Tom, how are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks, Laura, very much.
All right.
Tom,
The company okay?
Tom, yeah,
everybody.
we were trying to figure out your hat.
Not the, have you ever seen the movie 1984, The Natural,
Yeah,
with Robert Redford?
Yeah.
This is the hat from the film.
too funny.
All right.
Okay, there you go.
I got the jersey as well, so I'm all set here.
The Knights, I love it. I'm gonna enjoy this. This is gonna be fun. So this is a pretty.
So he took, so Tom, yeah, I was just gonna say that, Tom, he took the casually advice pretty literally, huh?
Oh, yeah.
That's the point.
Well, hi,
These are my kind of meetings.
everybody. Still uploading some participants. Just a few seconds.
All right. I'm going to send Alex a quick note, make sure he's good.
All right. And if you line and want to use your chat box to say hi and where you're from, we'd love to hear from you. Oh, I see several of our panelists as participants. Tom, I see Bob Edsel.
Okay.
Hey guys, thanks for joining us today.
I just sent Alex a quick note. So.
All right, thanks, Tom. Hi to Scott Huffman from Indianapolis. Rob says Heidi ho. That must be a Idaho thing. Hey, Janet from formerly of my screen. So many people are saying hi. It's rolling. Formerly with the U.S. Department of DOT. All right. Now a professor at GW. Excellent. Hey, Mark Kaplan. Good to see you again. We got Phil Oglesby from San Diego Law Enforcement Coordination Center. Right. And a few others. Hello to you. And Tom, why don't we go ahead and get started? And Alex will join us in a few, because we have some opening remarks I'd like to go through, and we're still waiting for one more. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and get our webinar started. I'd like to welcome you all to today's virtual discussion. Today we're going to talk about rail and truck transportation and how the pandemic has affected that mode of transportation over the past 2 months. I know I see some familiar names on the listener list, but as you may know, this is a series of virtual discussions that the All Hazards Consortium is having on business resiliency. We were due to have a conference, what was it, Tom, in about, it would have been this week, next week, I think it was.
Yep.
COVID took that down, but we're happy to bring the information to you virtually. So thanks again for joining us. And my name is Laura Johnson. I'm the Director of Events and Conferences for the nonprofit organization All Hazards Consortium. A couple quick notes. We are recording this, and we will send you a link to the recording post-webinar. So if you want to share that with any of your colleagues, coworkers, peers, you will get that in your inbox within a day. And I also want to let you know you've all been unmuted upon entry, but feel free to use either the Q&A function or the chat function to send us a note or ask a question, and we'll have plenty of time at the end of today's virtual discussion to get to that. And at the very end, if we have time there, we'll actually unmute all the microphones and give you a chance to say hi, let us know where you're from, and if you have any deeper questions that you want to get to. So I'd like to introduce Tom Moran, who is the Executive Director for the All Hazards Consortium. Tom?
Laura, thank you. Alex is dialing in. I just promoted him to panelist. So Alex, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
And now we can hear you. Very good.
Thanks, Alex.
So good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Really happy to have everybody join us. This is a big topic. We are just scratching the surface here on the transportation issues. Myself and a number of the panelists, as well as a number of you, have been on a lot of calls over the past couple of months, specifically with COVID related, but there's been cyber issues. There've been a number of issues on this. And so the purpose of this was, as Laura mentioned, we were planning a national resilience summit. We were, the board and working groups of the consortium said we need to create a forum annually to bring together federal, state, and private to discuss key use cases and issues. Transportation is a big one. So I'm really glad Alex and Tom and Dan have been able to join us here, and I'm really looking forward to getting into this. So if you're new to the consortium, you might hear things mentioned on a call called the SISE, the SISE. This is a private sector framework that's designed to protect identities and information when being shared sector to sector or sector to government. It kind of eliminates email and allows people to come together and share information. It allows people to work together on specific problems and come up with very specific solutions. Just for COVID, for example, multiple committees put together at least 6 different solutions for COVID, PPE related, transportation, other things, but all working together within the SISE. The SISE protects information from non-operational requests, from frivolous FOIA requests, all that stuff, and eliminates liability so people can come together and speak without fear of retribution and things like that. And boy, when you free them up to do that, it's amazing how quickly things can move. So you can register with a SISE, no cost at all at siceusa.org. But if you hear it mentioned, that's what we're talking about, is this framework's been in place since really 2015, run by the private sector. So with that, Laura, I'm gonna turn it back over to you and we can start with our operational discussion. I'm really anxious to hear and listen and get into this. Go ahead.
Yeah, Tom, and I do want to mention before we move on to introducing our panelists that the All Hazards Consortium is working on a webinar that takes a deep dive into the SISE. So for those of you who have been on the call or a few of these calls, I know we do a quick brief on it, but we'll actually get into it, do a demo, and really explain how you can leverage that. So look out for that. That's coming in the next month. So I'd like to introduce today's panelists. On the phone today, we have Alex Keenan with USDOT. We also have Tom Farmer from AAR and Dan Horvath from the American Trucking Associations. We're going to ask the 3 of them a set of questions. And as I mentioned earlier, then we'll have some time for Q&A. So if anyone online has specific issues, comments, or even solutions that you want to share, we'll have plenty of time to get to that. So first question deals with the operational impacts. And Alex, if I can, I'm going to start with you on this one. If you can describe the operational impacts that COVID-19 has had or is having on DOT and the current challenges that you're facing. And before you answer the question, if you could just take a few seconds to introduce yourself, that would be great.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Laura and Tom. This is Alex Keenan. I'm the Emergency Coordinator and Security Officer for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. We call it FMCSA. FMCSA is one of the 10 agencies within the Department of Transportation. I've been in this position since 2002. Prior to that, I spent 30 years in the Coast Guard doing the same job. So after 9/11, I left the Coast Guard, retired, and went to work for DHS for CBP for a year and a half, did the same job, left there and came to the department in 2002, 2003. So I've been in the job for quite a while. I'm probably one of the most senior emergency coordinators with the Department of Transportation. My specialty is really more of hurricane evacuation and so forth, because that's what I spent most of my career in the Coast Guard dealing with, was the hurricane seasons and so forth. But as we move forward for COVID-19, I have been involved since January 20th. Back in early January, the Secretary's office says, you know, we need to put a group of folks together to talk about this COVID-19 that is starting to impact the aviation community. Well, my specialty is bus and trucks, so I thought, well, I'll sit on the panel. I'm not sure where trucks and buses will come into play, but eventually it seems to all work out. And so we'll start off as 6 airports accepting passengers from China, turned into 8 airports, and then 12 airports and so forth. And then before we knew it, there was a pandemic going on, and the shelves at the grocery store started going empty, and people started wondering why there wasn't toilet paper and water and products on the shelves, and how can the motor carrier section help. So that's where the trucking industry got involved. And back then we decided on March 13th that we're going to issue a regional declaration just to help fill the grocery store shelves up. And then it went on. Then a week later, we found out it impacted the fuel, it impacted the raw materials. We found out that liquor distributors were now making hand sanitizing, and they needed alcohol contents, different type of alcohol contents, so forth, toilet paper manufacturers, so forth, pulp mills. So we extended the regional declaration on March 18th, and that declaration will expire this Sunday. So it's ran for about 3 months, and we've extended this declaration, but this time around, we're just giving waivers for people for livestock and livestock feed, because there's still a concern with the meat products and the meat processing, as well as ventilators, shipment of ventilators and medical equipment, as well as hand sanitizers. So what started on March 13th, FMCSA has worked with each of the individual 50 states, and our declaration covered all 50 states, and we worked with the states on the opening and closing and the phase ones and everything, and we end up posting on our website over 120 regional declarations. In fact, today we issue a declaration for the continuing of the learner's permit. If I'm a CDL driver and I want to apply to learn the CDL business and get a license, I have to go through a learner's permit, just like a driver's ed program. So there's some exemptions to that. There's some exemptions to the medical waivers and so forth. So it's really turned out since January 20th. It's been my full-time job representing the motor carriers, and it doesn't really seem that it's slowing up a little bit, but as we move forward, there has been a lot of challenges. The first big challenge, and I'll just throw this out, was the trucking industry. First, there was a great need to have truckers to operate under emergency exemption to deliver groceries, supplies and goods, medical supplies, so forth. But with that said, there was a lot of things that were not being delivered. So it kind of was a big boost for the industry for the first couple weeks or the first month, but about mid-April, end of April, 1st of May, it started hurting the industry, because we found out that there wasn't as much business. Truckers weren't getting loads because they weren't accepting everything. You know, it's one thing moving frozen pizzas, but you did really have a big demand to move house plants and garden hoses and things like that. So it really hurt the industry. For the bus community, they just took a hard hit. Nobody got on a Greyhound bus. Nobody got on a Metro bus. And they hit hard. Probably 80% of their business just came to stop. So that's kind of where we're at. Those are the challenges we were facing, still facing, although the trucking industry is starting to rebound a little bit more and so forth. And we're hoping the commercial bus industry will start coming back. But it's a slow process. And it really, an industry where 80% of our household goods, our clothing, our food items are all shipped by tractor and trailer, could really put a hard constraint. I would say it was more of a hard constraint onto the trucking industry. A lot of the mom and pops, which is a big majority of the American Trucking Association, they have 10 or less drivers, 10 or less trucks. Same way as the bus community, they took a hard hit. They just couldn't afford to keep drivers around if there wasn't any work. So those are the challenges that we faced, and we tried to adjust. The federal government, FMCSA, we tried to adjust as much as we could with exemptions and waivers to take some of that pressure off of not only our drivers looking for work, but, you know, where if their CDL license expired, the state motor vehicle department was closed. How do they get a medical exam if there's nowhere to go get an exam and so forth? So those are the challenges we faced and we're still facing, but we're slowly, hopefully, looking for a full recovery. That's all I have.
All right, Alex, thank you so much. So Dan, I saw you nodding quite a bit. He obviously talked a lot about the trucking and being a representative of the ATA. Can you share with us the impacts that it's had on not only on your members, but also on your association?
Yeah, certainly. And I'm nodding and kind of chuckling. I wish I would have had Alex's cell phone number about 3 months ago. What he just talked about there in a nutshell, I mean, is everything that myself and my team and our folks at ATA have been engaged in the last, I mean, really since beginning middle of March for this. If you had to ask me the beginning of March what I thought of this thing called COVID-19, the coronavirus, I kind of chuckled and I'm like, it's nothing. And boy, was I wrong. And we really, I think, learned of the true impacts of that. And it really hit home for me one day when I ran out of toilet paper at home and couldn't find any at the stores. That's when I said, you know what, we need to do something about this. So
TMI, Dan, TMI.
all kidding aside,
but everybody relates to what you just said. I can tell you.
Right.
When you went to a store early on, the first couple weeks of this pandemic, and you saw that shelves were empty, but you might go back the next day or that afternoon and you saw that shelves were restocked. Maybe you couldn't find something on a Monday, but it was there the next day, vice versa. You knew the truck drivers were doing their jobs and they were getting the job done. And really a lot of that was thanks to, and I know we're going to talk about partnerships later, but a lot of that was thanks to the waivers and exemptions that we had in place. I'd say the first several weeks of coronavirus dealing with this, probably from about St. Patrick's Day, so March 17th on, the biggest impacts that we were dealing with our members were some of the, what I like to refer, knee-jerk reactions to different states and policies that they implemented. I hate to throw them under the bus just because they're a home state of mine. I grew up there, but Pennsylvania was pretty quick to close down their rest stops, their state-run rest stops and service facilities throughout the state. And while that may have made sense, I mean, the goal was to protect the workers that are working in these facilities. When you have truck drivers that are delivering to stores across the country that rely on these facilities to stop, rest, find something to eat, take the required rest break, it's a pretty huge impact. And we've had a truck parking problem going into this pandemic. So that certainly didn't help. So we were playing kind of reactionary, taking reactionary measures the first couple weeks there to react to rules and legislation that had passed and emergency proclamations that closed rest stops, service plazas. Pennsylvania was one of the first. Luckily, we were able to get half of those opened up in the first couple of days, working with our state partners there, and then really working to educate other states that to let them know on the forefront. If you go down this route, here's potential unintended consequences. I've never said that any of the actions that were taken by any state governors or any agency for that matter were nefarious in nature. It's just that we need to take into account all the impacts, and especially in our industry with trucking, and how that's going to work. So that was one of the biggest ones, was the state closures of rest stops. We had a lot of concerned drivers reaching out to us the first several weeks of this. I mean, really, what am I going to do? How am I going to get food? And if you've ever driven a truck before, it's not that easy to pull off the interstate and zip into McDonald's or Wendy's or whatever and go through. You can't pull a tractor trailer through a drive-through. At least you can if you don't want to de-decorate the side of your truck. But issues like that came up. And then second to all that, which a lot of what Alex has mentioned, impacts of what do you do with a driver who has an expired commercial driver's license? They can't get into the state driver's license agency to renew it because that state's closed. So we dealt with a lot of our safety directors early on throughout our trucking companies, working with them to kind of curb a lot of these issues. So I could go on and on about this. I mean, I think Alex really shined a lot of that light. And I should have said this for the forefront. ATA, in my role at ATA, safety policy, vice president of safety policy, I mean, we work mainly with safety departments within trucking companies across the nation. So representing thousands and thousands of trucking companies and not just huge companies, mid-sized, small-sized companies. So these were a lot of concerns, and I can tell you, like the first 2-3 weeks, I'd get one email on a particular topic, and throughout the day, you get the same email asking the same question over and over. We had a lot of challenges. I mean, it was a hectic few weeks sorting through all of the state rules and regulatory actions and figuring out how do we fix these, how do we address these, and getting that information out there to our members.
Dan, we forgot to ask you to say hi. What is your role with the ATA?
Yeah, so safety policy, so really all things safety. My team, we mainly work with Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, so FMCSA, DOT, NHTSA, Federal Highway Administration, but really my team's kind of function is the regulatory side of rulemakings that come out from USDOT, their impacts on truck drivers and motor carriers. I've been on board with ATA about a little over about 2.5 years now. Prior to that, spent some time working for a driver leasing firm. And then before all that, actually, is a contractor for DOT performing safety audits. So I have a little bit from the enforcement side, the operational side, and now the association role. And I'm proud to say before all that, I actually got my CDL, still have my CDL. So have a little bit of a driver perspective. So when we dealt with a lot of these COVID-19 related impacts, I mean, it's easy for me to be sitting in an office somewhere, or now even at home from my home office, and looking at a particular role that comes out and say, that's really not big of a deal. But then you put yourselves in the shoes of a driver who's having to deal with this, and it's pretty scary. So I'm pretty proud of the industry and the partnerships we form working through it to get through it all.
And Dan, you talked about the drain on the workforce. How much of that would you attribute to just the major increase for the demand for the supply versus truckers who got COVID or just didn't want to work because of COVID?
Yeah, I'd say all of the above. I mean, going into this, we had a driver shortage. We have economists who spend their every day looking into these numbers, and it was a driver shortage in a segment of over-the-road long-haul drivers. So not your typical local drivers are doing pickup delivery type things, but a driver that's hopping in the truck driving from one coast to another. So there was a shortage going into this. This certainly didn't help. Right from the start, we saw a huge uptick in freight volumes related to, just as I mentioned earlier, their trucks delivering to grocery stores. And things of that nature that were all covered under the FMCSA exemption. So critical supplies, medical supplies. But on the other side of that, and I think that was one of the early misconceptions, is that trucking was booming, which it was in that particular segment for our folks delivering to the stores. And as I said earlier, like using the toilet paper joke as an example, that was something that, if it wasn't for drivers delivering to the stores and restocking, we would have huge panic on our hands because you folks going and can't get their basic needs. That's a huge ordeal. And we saw that proven that truck drivers were able to continue delivering. Again, on the flip side, though, for instance, the auto industry, auto manufacturers were pretty early on. They shut down facilities here in the U.S., and a large portion of trucking is dedicated to delivering auto parts to these facilities. So you saw segments of that industry that their business went down drastically. Same thing, we saw a lot of impacts with food service deliveries to, say, restaurants. Not all restaurants were doing takeout early on with this. Some restaurants closed their doors, so we saw shifts for there. So we talk about this freight cliff that I won't even begin to get into because that's our economist. It's a lot smarter than me that talks all about it. But when we're over the cliff, volumes are way down now. We're seeing somewhat of a rebound, but we look to the future. It's going to be a while till we're back to where we were and to where we needed to be.
Sure. Thanks so much, Dan. That's so fascinating. I really appreciate that. So let's go ahead and move to rail. So I'd like to introduce Tom Farmer from AAR. Tom, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and also how COVID has impacted the rail industry.
Sure. Thanks, Laura, very much. Thank you, Tom, for arranging this opportunity. I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Security with the Association of American Railroads, and in that position, I'm privileged to manage the railroad industry's coordinating committees for physical anti-terrorism security, rail security working committee, and for cybersecurity, the Rail Information Security Committee. The Rail Security Working Committee is actually rooted in the 9/11 attacks. Its principal focus had been terrorism, but over time, with the expansion of security-related responsibilities into emergency preparedness concerns, the scope of my responsibilities have grown with it. And cyber security, which was not even included in my job description when I applied for this position 10 years ago, now easily takes up half of the time that I dedicate to my work hours. In terms of the COVID-19 impacts, significantly, we did not have and have not had a significant impact to our workforce. That includes Amtrak as the nation's principal nationwide passenger rail carrier. Each day since the latter part of March, chief operating officers with the 7 major freight railroads, called Class 1 railroads, they're responsible for about 85% of the operations infrastructure in the U.S. and Canada. And Amtrak, as well as Genesee and Wyoming, which is a major operator of regional and short line railroads. So you've got with that group, again, 85+% of the operations and infrastructure here in the U.S. and Canada, and even in some of the operations in Mexico. With those calls each day, there were daily reports on the status of each railroad's rates of infection, and thankfully they have remained low. That is not accidental. Going back to the end of January, railroads maintain chief medical officers as part of their functional staffs. They have had responsibilities over many years in addressing health, the safety, welfare of workers. With H1N1 a decade ago, they expanded that scope into pandemic flu response, pandemic illness response. And so they've adapted that work for COVID-19. Since the end of January, they were involved regularly with representatives of the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, specifically talking about containment and mitigation measures. And so that CDC guidance has been put into effect thoroughly going back to the latter part of January. We believe that's contributed markedly to the very low rates of infection we've maintained. There are other modes of transportation that have not been nearly so fortunate. The major one is public transportation. I think tragically in that mode, more than 120 workers have died in total as a result of COVID-19 infection. They didn't all get that infection from exposure at work, but some certainly did. And that's certainly driven parts of our efforts to ensure we're getting the right equipment into their hands to enhance the safety of the work environment. The economic impacts have been substantial. There was reference earlier to impacts on Greyhound busing. I think intercity busing ridership has dropped by something in the 95% range. Mass transit agencies, that includes commuter railroads, subways, light rail systems, they've also seen declines in ridership in the 90+% range. Amtrak has had a 90+% drop in its passenger usage. That's significant for Amtrak because its revenue is a substantial part of its budget. So the economic impacts have been very significant for freight railroads. We've seen drops in carloads. That's our principal measure of the economic health of our industry. Drops in carloads moved in the 20% range. That's substantial in a multi-billion-dollar industry. How have we dealt with that? There have not been significant layoffs in the rail industry. And what railroads have done is they've retained their workforce. In some cases, they've implemented flexible type scheduling. They may have staff work 3 weeks out of a month and they go on unpaid leave for 1 week out of the month. But we've kept the infrastructure, the capability in place to resume operations fully as the economy comes back into a more vibrant state because of the relaxation of the lockdowns and the progressions of the state's reopening plans. So we've often been asked during the course of this pandemic if a problem with supplies getting to grocery stores, for example, is the supply chain, the capability to move it. And our consistent answer has been no. There's been no diminution in the capacity of railroads to move cargo to destination. We've maintained it. The demand has gone down because their level of economic activity has gone down. But the upside of maintaining the workforce as we have is that as the economic activity begins to pick up, and we're certainly seeing signs of that, the capacity to commit trains and commit employees to get the job done has remained in place. With reopenings, we're very attentive to indications of the virus resurfacing. Like many industries, many of our corporations have expanded dramatically these telework programs. If you are not in a field capacity where you have to be operating a train or working somewhere, maintaining infrastructure, it's likely that you're working from home. And so all that effort that's been devoted over a period of years to building the capacity for remote work. In our industry, that becomes very important. As an example, when you have a tropical storm or a hurricane, you can move an entire dispatch group from one part of the country to another, and they can operate that segment from railroad remotely. Well, that capacity has paid huge dividends now because we've been using that on a regular basis to deal with regional contingencies. Now we have to deal with it in the sense of a national contingency. So it's been very impressive to see how the infrastructure, the capacity, the networks have continued to function and the productivity has been maintained, even with large segments of the workforce operating at home. So I'll pause there. I think we get into some more efforts on initiatives to deal with the impacts, but I'm certainly open to any questions you may have on what I've covered thus far.
Hey, Tom, somebody, this Tom Moran, somebody asked me one time, how many quote unquote employees or contract, what is the population of the rail sector as far as, you know, employees and contractors, so forth? I didn't have the answer for that. Maybe I thought.
Sure. No, the total number of railroad employees exceeds 180,000 in the United States. That does not include the workforce in Canada and Mexico. So 180,000 plus railroad employees. Most of them work for what are termed the 7 Class 1 railroads. Those are the major freight railroads that operate in the U.S. and Canada. So that's CSX, BNSF, Norfolk Southern, Kansas City Southern, Union Pacific, Canadian National, and Canadian Pacific. And then a substantial segment work as well for Genesee and Wyoming. That is an operator of numerous regional and short line railroads. In terms of contractors, you could, in a sense, almost double that figure for some of the contract support that we have throughout their respective organizations. So it is not uncommon to have contractors working side by side in field locations with railroad workers. And that's been a consideration when we've looked at, for example, equipping railroads with enough personal protective equipment to ensure they've got good coverage both for their employees as well as contract support they take on.
So Tom, let's just jump into it since we have you on mute. You talk of adjustments that you've made to the monthly work schedule for your employees. So what other initiatives have you taken to address how COVID has affected operations as it relates to rail?
Sure. So I think the major one I referenced generally in the opening remarks, and that's the role of the chief medical officers and the coordination with CDC and the early implementation of guidelines so that we were adjusting the conditions in our workplaces at the earliest practicable stage. So we got more and more information on the potential effects of the virus. For the work that I do, I look at my role as trying to facilitate successful outcomes in the railroad. So what is it that we can do at the association that creates conditions for greater effectiveness in the railroads? And we have looked to areas that have been priorities for our industry going back many years. So it has not been so much a question of developing new initiatives to deal with this problem. It's adapting what we've already been doing and applying it to different circumstances. The railroad industry has operated under a unified security plan, physical and cyber, going back 2 decades to the aftermath of 9/11. And the cooperation we've had as an industry through that process has created capacity to work in concert in a whole range of areas, including emergency preparedness and response. So as a regular course of business, we are extensively sharing information, holding regular coordination sessions, engaging with government on unified priorities we take as an industry. And all that effort, I had the opportunity to brief our industry's chief executive officers on where we stand in the efforts on COVID-19 here in the past couple of weeks. And the point I made is all of that work that's been done for the better part of the last 2 decades, all the exercises conducted, all the lessons learned, all the investments made in capabilities to maintain secure platforms for incident reporting and effective sharing of information, all the effort we've done in maintaining unified priorities of government, sometimes for a tediously long time, because it takes government a great deal to change its way of doing business. That's not a critique. It's a credit that you actually have partners who are willing to go through that long process on the government side to get to those accomplishments. But so all of that effort, we look at what happened here with COVID-19, and all that effort paid off because when you get to issues that we could support the industry in, the ability to do that was ever present. So a major one for us is worker access. And early on, we understood, perhaps sooner than even at the federal government, they began to anticipate it. We figured at some point, because of COVID-19, quarantines are going to be put in place within states. So there are going to be areas that were simply going to be cordoned off to try to contain the virus. So interestingly enough, on March 4th, before any state had issued any quarantine order, we had a request for information into DHS, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, on exempting essential workers in critical infrastructure sectors from state restrictions on activities. So if it was a curfew, if it was some form of travel quarantine, if it was some form of restriction on business activity, that the essential workers would be allowed to continue to do their jobs and would not have to be stopped repeatedly by law enforcement officers and questioned as to why they were in the area. And 2 weeks later was when DHS came out with the Essential Critical Infrastructure Workers Guidance. And that guidance is an exceptional outcome in terms of how quickly it was put together. But the foundation for it, the thought process behind it, goes back many years. Work done in our sector, work I did when I was chair of the Critical Infrastructure Cross-Sector Council. We've set a priority, this identification of essential workers and assuring their access for many years. So we've had very positive outcomes in assuring worker access. We've had an endorsement of the fact that to justify their status as essential workers, industries would use access letters, justification letters that would accompany the guidance. That's been very effective. When the guidance was issued, a couple of weeks later, the first interstate travel quarantine orders began to come into effect. And so we began to have workers blocked going in their commuting across state lines in some areas. And a unified approach through the Transportation Sector Coordinating Council with our partners at DOT and TSA led to a joint government industry request to FEMA and DHS to reiterate with state governors that the guidance was intended to apply to the broad range of restrictions. And so what could have been very disruptive was resolved in a matter of days.
Wow.
And then when it came time to look to making sure our employees had the protection they need, and I'll just use this one more example because it's particularly significant. I think FEMA started a very well conceived initiative in terms of getting support to certain sectors through non-medical grade facial covering. So when CDC changed its guidance on April 3rd and said, oh, these facial coverings should be worn as a protective measure, the dynamic changed dramatically and suddenly the demand for these facial coverings skyrocketed. Well, the ability of the market to meet that demand was not there, and FEMA launched an initiative to try to alleviate shortfalls that some sectors were experiencing. For whatever reason, transportation was not included in that initiative in April of this year. As we learned about its particulars, and as we understood the challenges that organizations in our sector were having, particularly, again, mass transit agencies where we had, unfortunately, by then 80 plus fatalities, we made a big push with FEMA and DHS, again, unified with our co-sector specific agency leads, DOT and TSA, for an initiative to allow for the delivery of facial coverings to transportation organizations. And it took us about a month to get the arrangement in place, but I can say now that nearly 16 million facial coverings have been delivered across each of the transportation modes, aviation, maritime, and surface. They're reusable, they're washable, they can last for an extended period of time, and we've got good coverage in those industries going several months into the future. What did we do? What was the initiative? The initiative was unified position among the transportation modal representatives, going to government through the Government Coordinating Council, Sector Coordinating Council process, getting support from our co-sector specific agencies at DOT and TSA, and then it becomes a unified government industry request to DHS, CISA, and to FEMA for a specific outcome. And that changed what the policy was at FEMA at that point. They had stopped the private sector initiative. All further issues were going to go to the states. We recognized that the likelihood of transportation organizations being high in the priority list for states issuing facial coverings was not really practical. It was not going to happen. We pushed very strongly with this unified government industry approach, and we got the desired outcome. If we've got a key lesson learned out of this, is that another area that has been in place for a long time, this Government Coordinating Council, Sector Coordinating Council process under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan can be used very effectively to achieve productive outcomes when you have unity of interest, unity of effort on some certain agreed priorities. And government industry won't always agree on many things, but there are some core fundamental priorities in which we do agree. And what we have learned here in this work with the COVID-19 effort is if you've got unity among the transportation modes and the Sector Coordinating Council, that can trigger unity with your partners in government, and you then end up with a joint government industry position going to other aspects of government to get the outcome you want. That's been a key lesson learned. It's been a demonstration of what I think was the intent when the National Infrastructure Protection Plan concept was put into effect now something like over 15 years ago. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. Hey, you mentioned earlier that cyber was over 50% of your job, and I'm curious, how has your work in the cyber field changed since COVID?
I think that the change since COVID is we've had to have much greater attentiveness to indicators of potential cybersecurity concern because the attack surface is much broader. You now have lots of staff, numbering in the tens of thousands in different corporations working from home. And you're using remote platforms that have not been used to this extent previously. So here's another success story, I think, because CISA and the FBI have done a really good job of providing alerts focused on activity that has been seeking to leverage opportunities created by COVID-19. In some senses, that's trying to leverage the fact that the attack surface is greater because of the broader use of remote platforms and teleworking. In other senses, it's trying to take advantage of the fact that there's a great deal of interest and fear inspired by COVID-19. So you can induce people to open emails and files that they ought not open because of how you craft that subject and you focus on that particular issue. So, and that's been the most significant difference, but it's also reinforced what we had as a priority in the transportation sector for a long time. And it's something we're pursuing through a newly formed group called the Surface Transportation Security Advisory Committee. It's a congressional mandate to TSA. It was established last year. But one of the priorities we set in that committee, and it's a grouping that has representatives from rail, freight and passenger, mass transit, pipeline, trucking, intercity busing. That group has set as one of its priorities the importance not just of this government information sharing, but of creating an information sharing hub within transportation so that we can get early sharing of indicators of concern among transportation organizations. So I think we've had good reporting that happens in a directional fashion from transportation organizations to partners in government. If they have a significant cybersecurity concern, you'll have, for example, a pipeline organization making a report to DHS or to the FBI. But what you're not having is looking at those reports with a sense of, is there something about what's happening here that would be beneficial for organizations across transportation to know about? And I think experience shows that when a portion of an industry is targeted with illicit cyber activity, where there are attempts to perpetrate breaches, that's likely not the only segment of the industry that's experiencing that activity. And we are firm believers that information can be used very effectively to make prevention attainable. And so we've put a great deal of effort in the rail industry. We're very free in the information that we share. We take out the identifying information for affected railroads, but when a railroad reports a cybersecurity concern to us at the Association of American Railroads, we have a function that we operate called the Railway Alert Network, and we share that reporting widely. It doesn't say who the specific railroad is, but it does focus on what's most important. What was the activity? What were the indicators of that activity? What did you do about it? And we think that sort of sharing happening where organizations are reporting what they're seeing, and we can expeditiously get that information not just out among railroads, but also out across transportation modes so that organizations across the board have an opportunity to take some sort of action to address that concern. I can tell you over the past year, I can point to 6 instances in specific occasions in which we have had a railroad report a significant cybersecurity concern. We put out an advisory on it, and later that same day, other railroads began to experience that same activity. But the difference was, since they had information on it, since they knew what the indicators were, they'd already put measures in place to block that particular activity. They geared their networks with a protective measure to address it. And we think that sort of cooperation across transportation can really elevate our security posture and narrow the chance that we'll be susceptible to the sorts of concerns that unfortunately have impacted other industries. Thanks very much for the opportunity to address that issue.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Man, I could do this webinar for 3 hours. You guys are a wealth of information.
No,
Alex Keenan, are you still on the line?
All right, just a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't really appreciate where trucking meets rail, right? This is really a key interdependency. The other thing I didn't realize is how much of the trucking industry are small companies, right? I mean, you got your big ones, but it's like everything else, these small entities and how they're so dependent upon this stuff. It's really amazing. Anyway, I'm just making note. Thank you, Tom, for sharing that. But as Alex and Dan had mentioned, I just thought, this is a key sector. We haven't even touched on some of the other issues. So yeah, this could go on for a while. So
this is why I love my job. I learn something new all the time. Alex, how are you?
I'm doing good.
Okay, Alex, we'd like to address this question to you. Go ahead.
Okay. You want me to follow up with?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, to follow up with Tom and Dan, especially Tom's coordination on the Coordination Council, I'm part of that as well as each of us. And it was a huge factor this time around. FMCSA, in partnership with FEMA and associations and various entities, we were able to put out 3.1 million masks to truck and bus operators. So that was a huge partnership. We had state troopers at way stations handing out masks to truck drivers, and it was good. It was really good. I mean, if we will promote health and safety, we had to start with our truck drivers. And what brought that about was back in early April, there was the quarantine in New York City. So if you're a truck driver and you deliver a load of groceries to a grocery store under the quarantine rules in New York City, they want that truck driver, if they got outside their truck in the open air and in contact with somebody on the loading dock, they want them quarantined for 14 days. Well, that was devastating for the trucking industry because people started saying, wait a minute, yeah, I'll deliver a load anywhere you want, but I'm not going to New York City because I can't afford to be sitting in a parking lot for 14 days. So we worked through those issues with associations, with our counterparts, with the government council, with the states, and we finally got it worked out where they were exempt, and that's where Tom talked about. CISA, DHS came up with essential government workers, metro operators, truck drivers, dock workers, railroad engineers, airplane pilots, and all that. So that came out. So that was one of the things. The other thing that Dan had talked about was the food source. We were able to open up the rest stops, even though Pennsylvania, Wyoming, and some of these places just closed their rest stops because they said they could operate them under a limited budget. But they were able to get some food trucks in there. They were able to get rest stops where even volunteers handed out food. And then we found out a lot of the local communities was supporting the trucking industry. And so they were helping out in this and that. So it's been a challenge for the mom and pop truck operator, even the medium-sized operators, because where they had a set schedule that I picked up loads from A, B, and C supply company every day for the last 10 years, well, A, B, C, and supply company might not be in business anymore, or they might have closed their doors. So as a truck operator and as a business person, I had to go find new leads. I had to go find new manufacturers, new distributors, and so forth. And that's where the trucking industry is doing now. They've kind of had to throw out the old playbook and says that's not going to work anymore. And they're dealing with new freight brokers. And there's a lot of, as Tom mentioned, there's a lot of cybersecurity fraud opportunities that exist when people can sit around and say, well, I can do this. Hijacking of loads, just lots of things. And as the security officer for motor carriers, that's about 50% of my job also. So the last thing I want to do is throw out about the CARES Act. The CARES Act, there was 3 parts. The next act, 0. The trucking industry did get any of that. The bus operators did get any of that money. I mean, maybe some of the big operators did, but a lot of the mom and pops never got that opportunity to say, hey, I can get a grant, I can get a loan from the federal government, will keep me operating for the next 6 months, this and that. So we have had some protests. There were peaceful protests. If you remember, if you're around D.C., back on June 3rd, we had one. Actually, next 17th of next week, they're going to have, looks like maybe the bus operators are going to have a protest at the state capitals. So everybody, they felt like the trucking and bus industry, it felt like, hey, you build out the airlines, you're building out some other transportation modes, but the truck and bus companies did get built out. And so those are some challenges. And as we move forward, we're trying to work with those entities to make sure that we at least have a level playing field and so forth. So that's where motor carriers has not only have we looked at it from a regulatory standpoint, but we're also looking at how can we help get the economy back on track in the trucking and bus operations. That's all I have.
Thank you, Alex. Dan, what initiatives has the ATA taken to address what's happened since COVID-19?
So this one is incredibly simple, but I think one of our best steps that we did early on that helped us in the long run was we formed an internal task force pretty early on. It was about the first week of March or so. At that point, we didn't know what we were facing. We really didn't. But the purpose of our internal task force was to address the individual areas that we needed to be involved in. So not just, for instance, the closing of statewide stops, but what state issues do we have through all 50 states? So we had one person on our task force that was responsible for reporting on a daily basis of what was going on, what he was hearing from our state trucking associations. We had our HR department on that because not only are we dealing with our association members, we have our own internal staff of about 185 folks that we got to deal with from home conditions, making sure folks are able to work remote. With that, our IT department, having our IT department on board to ensure that we could facilitate the remote working so we can in turn support our members. So while I say that was a simple step, I mean, it was a huge step because me as a safety person and head of our task force, I'm not thinking of the HR intricacies for people reporting into the office, or if one of our employees gets sick with COVID-19, or the IT issues that go along with it. So it was really a great purpose of information to share with it, have daily reports that went out, and then we could facilitate this information on to our members. So that was one of the early initiatives. To what Tom mentioned and what Alex reiterated on, our work early on with FEMA, or Department of Homeland Security, and that CISA guidance. That guidance was so instrumental with helping getting that word out to our members. Even though that guidance was, just as I said, it was guidance. It wasn't a law that said that this worker can get a get out of jail free card. I mean, it was so instrumental in us providing that information to our members to help our drivers do simple things like drive to work. We had a lot of situations where we had drivers crossing state borders and not necessarily crossing state borders in a truck, but in their personal vehicle to drive across the border and report to their terminal and get in a truck and getting stopped. I mean, that was a panic early on. Like, heck, I can't get to work. I think the earliest issue that we had was with California and some warehouse workers out there not being able to report in, and I think it was San Francisco because of stay-at-home work orders. So the first, I want to say it was the first round of guidance that came out from CISA that did not have the truck driver specifically spelled out in it, and we were able then in the second version that came out to have truck driver acknowledged as an essential worker. And it was a small victory for us. I mean, we're cheering it that we finally got it identified. And again, it was just guidance, but we had our state agencies, our state associations, and then in turn our members copy that guidance, physically hand it to our drivers and say, if you are stopped, you can show them that you're an essential worker. This is why you should be able to continue on the path. So to Tom's other point that of the crossover between rail and trucking, yeah, we each battled our own intricacies, but there were so many common themes that we all encountered and steps that we're taking and partnerships to get what we needed done, and through that with FMCSA. I mean, that as Alex mentioned, that initial statement from New York City, that was actually in one of the presidential's daily press briefings where they say, if you've been in New York, you need to quarantine for 14 days. My phone never rang so much that evening and the next day from carriers, from drivers, start saying, we're not going to go into New York anymore if that's the case. So you have that impact. Then you have the impact of, can you imagine New York City, residents of New York City, to realize if they don't have trucks coming in anymore because of this? We actually had a couple shipments denied, and one was in Iowa, one was in another Midwestern state, because that driver had been in New York City in the past 14 days. So again, maybe a well-intentioned statement to help slow the spread of COVID-19, but not taking into account the broader impacts. So we had a heck of a lot of effort going to working with FMCSA, and they were great to put out a statement there that said that this doesn't apply to drivers. You should be exempt from this because of precautions taken, that type of thing. So again, an area where there was a quick reaction to something, but caused a lot of headache for us to kind of fix it on the back end and how it applies to our industry.
All right, Dan, thank you so much. All right, let's move on to partnerships. And Alex, I'm going to start with you on this one. Other than the AAR and the ATA, can you tell us about key partnerships that were utilized, that you had in place, or new ones that you made to help you get through the issues you face with COVID?
Well, I think the largest partnership, besides the associations, was the states. This was the first regional declaration in the history of FMCSA, and I can only go back to 2000, that we had issued a regional declaration that covered all 50 states and District of Columbia. So what does that mean? That means that COVID-19 was not just a New York City and a San Francisco problem. It was a problem everywhere. And so to go across the board and say, you're closed to medical centers and medical offices and clinics where truck drivers can not go get physicals. You've closed all your DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, in each of the states where truck drivers cannot go get a CDL license. You've closed this and you've closed that. So we reached out to all 50 states and District of Columbia and said, here's what we can do. Since FMCSA DOT is the regulator of these requirements of getting a CDL, having a license, having this, having the proper credentials, this and that, let's all together work together, reach out, and let's all come up with a plan that will work for the industry so we can stock the shelves at the grocery stores, we can get medical supplies, ventilators, we can get fuel to the gas stations, we can get essential supplies that the American people or have a great need for. And that's what we did. We reached out to the other states. We came together. We met with the states. We called them every day. We had conference calls daily, and we all came to agreement, yes, let's extend this. FMCSA supports it. We want to do it, but we need the state's help. And this was, again, the first time in history that we've included all 50 states where they all pitched in. Everybody said, yes, this is what we're doing. That's what we did. And that's where we came out with these 120 emergency declarations of if you have a CDL license that expires, you're good till June 30th. If you have a medical certificate that expires, you're good till June 30th. And in fact, we keep extending these cutoff dates. So it took the pressure off the truck driver, off the carrier, off the DMV, off the states, and it really allowed support to each of the governors that issued a regional declaration for COVID-19 that supported their efforts because it still allowed the truck drivers to bring supplies into their grocery stores, into their communities without having a truck driver sitting in a parking lot because they did not have enough hours on the clock for that day to drive and complete their mission. So that was the biggest partnership. I think the takeaway was our partnership with the states. Even though we already had a partnership, we went the ninth inning with the states on what reflections that we could do working together and how it benefit the American people and the American economy, and we're still doing that today.
Hey, Alex.
That's all I have.
Hey, Alex, this is Tom Moran.
Yes,
Just a
sir.
question. When you say partnership with the states, where does Federal Motor Carriers plug in at the state level? State DOT?
We plug into the DOTs, to the Highway Patrol, the local sheriff's department, and usually the governor's office. So it usually starts with the governor's office, goes to the DOTs, the weigh stations, the weighmasters, and then to the Highway Patrol because they're enforcing FMCSA's regulations when a trooper has inspecting a tractor and trailer and so forth. So it's the whole transportation sector,
Right.
Within the state.
Right. Yeah. The reason I asked, we saw a lot of gaps, I guess, just because nobody could plan for this. You know, you got health, emergency management, transportation police at the state level, right? And I mean, they're trying to do the best they can to protect citizens like that. It was crazy, and some states did it better than others. No critique.
Yeah.
This is part of the.
There was a lot of Tom. There was a lot of cross functions within the state. Yeah. And we try to help them through on because the Department of Motor Vehicles might fall under the administrative office and not under the state transportation director. So there was a lot, but you know, we were able to sort through it, and it took some states took a little bit more effort than others, but but we were able to work through it, and they were able to come together. We even helped them write the emergency declarations for the state. They never dealt with COVID-19, and what do I put in it? What does the governor's office put into it? So I spent a lot of midnight oil working with the governor's staff on what goes in a declaration and how it can support their states.
Wow. Okay. That's great. Yeah, no one could have planned for this, but I think everybody had a sense of urgency, and they did. The minute people knew that there were impacts, they tried to make corrections. I mean, this is just part of the process, right? So good.
Hey, Tom, what about your key partnerships?
I think specifically for COVID-19, the maturation of the coordinating council process developed through the National Social Protection Plan has been particularly impressive. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've been approaching a lot of these challenges in a unified way across transportation modes. And transportation is a very interesting sector. It's broken down into a series of modal sector coordinating councils. And the vision there, I think going back to when the National Social Protection Plan was developed, is that there were unique aspects of each transportation mode, and so they deserve the attention of a dedicated structure for sector-specific agencies with experts that specialized in their particular industry and the associated challenges and opportunities that get presented. But that fracturing does result in a situation where you didn't have unity of effort across modes of transportation. And so you might have individual organizations or individual modes within the transportation sector raising concerns, but that wasn't coalescing as a broader sector problem, sector challenge. And I think that really hamstrung our interaction, particularly with DHS, formerly Infrastructure Protection, now the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, as well as FEMA. What's happened with COVID-19 is you now really have what is a functioning sector coordinating council for the transportation sector at large. And so we've had a great deal of effectiveness in these partnerships we've created among the lead representatives for each of the sector coordinating councils for each mode of transportation. And so we have worked together on what are shared priorities. Yes, there are unique aspects to our operations, there are unique aspects to the challenges we face, but there are also areas in which we have clear shared interest. And that shared interest has been reflected in how we have approached some of the successes attained that have been described on this call. Getting essential critical infrastructure workers identified for transportation. Convincing DHS, CISA, and FEMA was a good idea to have that sort of guidance. Sharing information on worker access correspondence so that organizations across the modes of transportation had a frame of reference and how can I make sure my workers are justified properly. When we ran into those blocks that have been referenced in this discussion where our workers were being denied access, whether it was truckers who couldn't get to destination or people commuting to work who were held up at state borders, or in our case, we had 3 people placed in quarantine in Florida because their commercial aircraft landed unplanned stop in New Orleans. They never got off the airplane, but because they'd been through New Orleans, they were placed in quarantine in Florida. We were able to resolve all of those issues directly through each of the modal representative organizations. But the priority we took back to CISA is we need to have clearer instructions to state and local governments on effective use of the guidance. And if you look at version 3.0 of that guidance, there are significant areas where verbatim input from this unified transportation industry approach have been added. And it addressed a lot of those concerns about lack of specificity in identifying categories of workers, but it also had much clearer direction to the states on what is this guidance actually intended to be used for, what are we looking to exempt, and not just from a stay-at-home order, but from this broad range of different types of orders in the different states. There's been much better information sharing among transportation modes. We've shared a great deal of information related to COVID-19 guidelines, what are organizations doing as part of their recovery plans, return to work, increasing staffing at work, whatever category they happen to be in. We've shared a lot of information related to cybersecurity concerns. And what we're looking to advance on now is as more and more economies reopen, as lockdowns are ended, you're going to see more and more people beginning to use transportation again, particularly public transportation, subways, buses, railroads. And we want to make sure there's confidence in the workforce that they are being properly attended to as essential workers. That means opportunities for testing. That means opportunities to ensure they've got adequate protective equipment, and confidence in the passengers that when they go and use these systems, there's a workforce that they know has been properly vetted and is healthy. And so the next area that we're looking for to advance on is try to leverage some of the references that we've seen in the past several weeks to prioritizing essential workers for testing, but changing that discussion into some action. And I think we're looking here in the coming days to offering transportation as an area where we could essentially have a test bed for how a worker prioritization program could function. So it's that level of cooperation among the representatives, these chairs of these sector coordinating councils in transportation, that has been the key partnership for COVID-19. And on top of that, because we've got unity across transportation modes on these priorities, when we go to our co-sector specific agency at DOT and TSA, we're able to get them to join us in these priorities. And it's a very strong position to be in when you're advocating with DHS and FEMA that this is not just a request of a transportation organization. This is not just a request of a particular mode of transportation. This is a unified position of the government and sector coordinating councils for the transportation industry writ large. That is a strong position to be in. And it has worked effectively to get results when we've had blocks to workers, to get results when we needed help on getting facial coverings for workers, and we're confident that it'll continue to work as long as we keep it in effect. So we've learned a great lesson here on the value of using this National Infrastructure Protection Plan process, again, in a way I think it was intended when it was first started, but really has come to fruition in response to COVID-19.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom, amen. And I think what's really great about the NIP framework, first of all, a lot of people don't know about the NIP framework still, but it provides that high level coordination, which is really critical. We work down at the lower level, but there's things that can't solve. You know, states can't solve some of these things with private sector. And I think the beauty of that NIP framework is to provide these macro issues, like you mentioned, Tom, bringing sister to the table, letting them, whoa, we need masks, we weren't included. I got to hit it to Chris Krebs and Sis. I mean, they really moved quickly, I think, based on what I heard, that they were able to fulfill that need. And what other forum do you have to do that? There isn't one that I know of, right? So you're right, that framework is wonderful.
Hey, Dan, I was curious if what key partnerships you utilized, if anyone approached you for a partnership, or if there was any partnership that surprised you out of all this.
Yeah, certainly, and not to beat a dead horse, but our partnerships with our federal agencies, USDOT, FMCSA, more specifically, it was critical. I mean, daily phone calls, conversations, to be able to get through this all with having great support from them. And at one point being asked, what does the trucking industry need? That's pretty, you know, it puts you in a perspective when you can respond to that. When this information is going directly through USDOT, through Secretary or through Elaine Chao, and then to the president eventually to provide that input early on. I mean, that was critical. Our state partnerships to our state trucking associations, American Trucking Associations has basically 50 state affiliates to our state partners. That was critical there on that front. You know, and other partnerships, even working with other trucking associations that may or may not always be in agreement with ATA and our policies and our kind of advocacy efforts. So working with partners there in order to work in getting personal protective equipment out to the drivers. Hand sanitizers, we talk about these safety, personal protective equipment getting out there. I mean, we had a distillery reach out to us early on and say, we are now making hand sanitizer instead of alcohol. How can we get this into the hands of truck drivers? So really early on, we were able to get 10 55-gallon drums of hand sanitizer manufactured by a distillery and basically paid for and sponsored by an insurance company, working through ATA to get that out to drivers. So something that you might not necessarily see. And we kind of mentioned early on, but partnerships through the state level, through enforcement agencies, through state police, it's scale houses, inspection stations where truck drivers are normally going through a DOT inspection, which typically in some cases they avoid going through that. And instead of having an officer tell them, okay, we're going to do an inspection, handing them a lunch on the side of the road. I mean, things of that nature. So that was pretty cool to see. A lot of great partnerships. through the state level, I think. And really, it was information sharing that helped us be successful as much as we were able to be throughout this process of getting word to the state, but then also finding from our boots on the ground through our drivers through the states what was actually taking place throughout the country. So that was really critical early on and throughout the process.
So much, Dan. I love hearing stories like that when people get, something like a lunch instead of a reprimand or whatever they might be getting. So thank you. All right, let's move ahead to some innovations and solutions. So Tom, I'll start with you on this question. Can you give us any innovations or solutions that were thought of or implemented to developing a more resilient service for your members?
So innovations. I think what I'm going to say in response to that is that we didn't necessarily have to innovate how we do business, more along the lines of adapting what we've been doing to the more unique circumstances presented by the virus. I give a lot of credit to the rail industry in this concept that was developed in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and establishing these coordinating committees for security. So the Rail Security Working Committee is the result of a concerted effort across the industry right after the 9/11 attacks, before there was a TSA, before there was a DHS, to look at the new realities of terrorism and security driven by what happened on 9/11 and recognizing that our industry could be a target, it could be a vehicle in trying to accentuate effects of an attack. And so that coordination set a foundation for so much of what has happened since. On the cyber side, ironically enough, they already had a coordinating committee, in fact, the Rail Information Security Committee before 9/11. It actually predated the year 2000 transition. The rails came together out of concern that that transition, the Y2K issue, could present some significant computer concerns. That cooperation proved so productive that they decided to keep in effect, recognizing that going forward, information technology is going to play a larger and larger role in railroad operations. And so it's a very powerful statement to be able to go into a meeting, particularly with government partners, and say that I am privileged to work for an industry that's had a cybersecurity committee focused specifically on that issue for 2 decades now. But both of those approaches have created the foundation for cooperation among railroads that have given us an ability to define priorities and priorities that we've stuck to for an extended period of time. And so when I'm able to talk to chief executive officers in our industry, chief operating officers in our industry, and say what we're accomplishing now in creating opportunities for our industry to continue to perform as well as the prevailing economic conditions allow, a lot of what we've achieved is a result of not an innovation that we did today, but innovation that maybe we did 15 years ago. And where we're achieving progress on things like identifying critical infrastructure workers, assuring worker access, working in a unified fashion with a one voice on clear priorities. When we go to government, we don't just say, this is a problem. We say, this is a problem. Here's why it's a problem. And most importantly, here is a solution. And then we articulate how that solution is beneficial, not just to our industry, not just to the transportation sector, but to government as well. And that approach has proven effective because we're not just simply pointing out problems, but we're advocating for solutions, and we're highlighting how those solutions will, in the long term and near term, be helpful to industry and to government. So I don't have any particular innovations to point to how we're doing business. Clearly, railroads in protecting the health of their workforces have innovated, but at my level, it's been more of a function of what have we done, what have we created the possibility to achieve based on what we've been doing. So a lot of the innovations happened before, and we're seeing it come to fruition now.
Now that makes sense, Tom. Thank you so much. Dan, would you like to add anything to this slide on any innovations or solutions that made a more resilient service for your members?
Yeah, and again, talking about simplicity, one of our early kind of tasks was we added to our website a landing page that our members, our drivers could go to for quick and easy access to information. And selfishly, it was an attempt to reduce the number of phone calls and emails I'd be receiving a given day, asking the same question, what's going on in Pennsylvania? What's going on in New York with this quarantine? So we were able, through the many media sources and interviews and everything we were doing, to promote our COVID-19 landing page and say, we're updating this by the hour We had a state chart up there that tracked different state regulatory changes. And the great thing about it wasn't just an ATA thing. It was any driver, anybody who wanted to could go on our website and look at that. And it was really a simple step, but a huge solution as far as the number of hits we were getting on it on a daily basis to get that information out there. And really to help dispel a lot of rumors. One of our, we get a lot of bad information early on. Like, I heard this is happening. I heard New York City's going under martial law right now. And I sit there and laugh. And but to put these kind of flashpoints up on our website, and we form Q&As, frequently asked questions, where you could put the question up there as far as that we were receiving and give the straight answer, and then really make a resource for drivers out there. So I think that was a quick one early on. A shout out to, and I'm biased because I started in the industry before trucking. I started in the bus industry actually. And we had a couple bus carriers early on. And even the American Bus Association, which is ATA's counterpart in the bus side, early on asked, how can they help? We had a couple carriers early on say, we have drivers in buses that are sitting that aren't moving. What if we take seats out of our buses and offer them up to help support cargo runs, just to give drivers a job? And so, I mean, that's an innovation, an idea I never thought of, but kudos to our bus friends for thinking of that and offering to help out the trucking industry. So I laughed, but at the same time, it was thinking outside the box. How do we, number one, keep somebody employed, because the bus industry was essentially shut down during this process, but then also offer to get freight to where it needed to be. So I think that was pretty cool innovation, an idea that came about.
Yeah, Dan, and I love how these questions intermingle sometimes, because you have, initiatives that lead to partnerships that lead to innovations, and it all rolls up into one big ball. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Laura, Dan, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Looking forward, okay. You all, first of all, your website was phenomenal. We were using that within the sites as a part of a collage of others. It was fantastic. Very great work. Looking forward, back to the innovation on the drivers and stuff like that. Are you guys planning or doing any work on capturing that? So if we have a next time, that best practice can be put out front early, so that states realize, hey, by the way, here's an army of people that can do stuff that they maybe hadn't thought of. I'm just thinking down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Tom. I think it's a relief in my role and position to, not talk about all the bad things related to COVID-19, but now kind of shift the focus onto forward planning in the future. What are our lessons learned? What have we learned throughout this whole process that we can do better? And there, I think it's a great segue. And that wasn't planned by the way, we're going to get a slide number 5 here, but
see, they all link into each other. I'm telling you.
But we're really asking, what did we learn early on that if this were to come up again, or some other issue, pandemic of that nature? Because really this was uncharted territory. I mean, I know there were a lot of comparisons to 9/11 and the industry after that. And there was certainly comparisons and some similarities between the two, but this was unique in and of itself, where, you had a complete shutdown almost throughout the entire country. So lessons learned wise, that's been a lot of the discussion we're doing now. Resources such as where can we utilize drivers? How do we get drivers in, potentially for drivers that have become sick? And that's across the board for the industry. And I would imagine for the rail industry as well, and figuring out employees and protections there. I'd say that the issue now that we're focused on the most is our economy and the response to trucking companies that unfortunately may have gone under or teetering under that line of bankruptcy as a result of not having business, being able to more easily adapt to freight that they've hauled traditionally, maybe shifting that to a different type of freight or commodity that's in more high demand, but being prepared as best as possible going forward. So where it isn't a week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, or even the CISA guidance that we keep referencing over and over again, not having it to where that took 3 or 4 rounds of updating to where we got it to where it needed, to where that if something happened in the future, we have that document ready to go and say these workers are clarified, classified as a essential worker. So that's one small example there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Hey, Alex, we didn't mean to skip over you on the innovations questions. If you want to touch on anything, especially what's come out of DOT on the innovations front, and also how are you planning for the weeks and months ahead?
Well, for the innovation, there's two things that came to mind listening to Tom and Dan. One was our website. Like I said, we have a lot of declarations. We've updated our website, the FMCSA's website, so you can pretty much go on there and find out anything pertaining to declarations, exemptions, and waivers and so forth. You know, it's the trucking community is one of the communities where there's a mixed mode of operators, as you have the large carriers, you have the medium size, and then you have the mom and pops. And when I started this job 18 years ago, you pretty much had to walk them through on what the exemption says and how to go about doing it. Today, that's different. These truck drivers, especially these team drivers where it's a husband and wife team, they're on top of it because that's money. You know, in the trucking industry, if the wheels aren't turning, you're not making money. And most of them got big truck payments each month that come due. So they get on there, they read these declarations, they understand it, they know what they got to have, they know if they get pulled over, they go through a weigh station, what they're exempt, this and that. So they have really educated themselves, and to great efforts of my counterparts here of having websites. You know, the website is the business to get information today, because otherwise it's just hard to come out and figure it out. Even the truck stops in America, the rest stops, the truck stops in today, Qualcomm, a lot of these truck stops, Pallets, Flying J's, they share as much information they can because that's good for their business and they want to keep customers coming back. So that's one aspect of the trucking community. Motor coach community has really stepped up to educate themselves and get it out to make it as helpful as possible to get out there, make a decent living, drive a truck, and do what is really a good hard day's work. The second element that came out of innovation was our own employees within our agency. We have close to 800 safety investigators, inspectors, border inspectors, and when we realized that people had to telework and social distance, we still had inspections and follow-ups we had to do with carriers. So example was if I had to do a yearly inspection on A, B, and C trucking, I will call them and say, here's the situation. I can't come and visit you. I don't really want you coming to visit me, but I think if I can work over the internet and we can exchange information, this is what I need, this is what you can provide, and we'll walk through it. And believe it or not, that has really turned the key for motor carriers because we've been able to do a lot of inspections since March 13th, and it has really kept the business flowing. The carrier's happy because they don't have some person sitting there in their living room or in their office all day photocopying papers. And plus, they can get the checklist completed. We can get it completed. We don't have to send somebody out there to drive 60, 70 miles to go and visit a carrier site. So it's something that we were always on the verge of doing, but we never did because it was something new. And so we always referred. So I think as we go forward in our inspections and our compliance process for motor carriers, we're going to say, you know what? I did it last year remotely. Why can't we do it this year? Let me give the driver a call. We'll see if we can do it and so forth. And that's been a plus because overall it saves everybody time, it saves money, and it allows the truck driver to get back on the road and do what they need to do. So those are my two thoughts.
That's great, Alex. Wow.
Yeah, thank you so much. Tom, what's next for the AAR as you navigate through COVID?
So given this one, so I was taking some notes as we led up to this question. I have a brief aside that has some relevance. I was privileged several years ago to participate in Israel in a security seminar. It brought together participants from several countries, including a group that came in from the Netherlands. And over lunch, we were having a discussion, and and they're very intrigued by, they kept saying the American dream. And I said, well, what are you talking in terms of? He said, well, there can't be an American dream in which people always make more money. Every generation can't make more money than last. And I said, well, you're missing the point. The point of the American dream is not making more money. It's having more opportunity. And as I look at what we've learned from COVID-19, opportunity is the watchword of where we go forward. We have an opportunity to restore confidence in passengers and get back into transportation, get back on airplanes, trains, buses. An opportunity to ensure that our workforce, as they begin to interact with the public more regularly because the ridership is going up, and interact more regularly with counterparts in other industries that have either been shut down or contracted because of the economic downturn, confidence that their health is going to be taken care of. So we placed an emphasis, one of the areas that we're focusing on next as a unified transportation sector approach is a prioritization for testing. Testing, in our view, is a confidence builder. It's a confidence builder in the employees when they get a negative test. If they're taking the right steps, facial covering, social distancing, where practicable, they're going to be less likely, their risk of contracting the virus is going to be significantly curtailed. And a confidence builder in the passengers, that when they use our systems, they know that the workforce has been tested, is getting regularly tested, and they're taking the right steps to protect themselves. That's all part of messaging, and messaging is vital now. Again, we've gone through an unprecedented downturn. We've put things on hold for a long time. We've had people now questioning whether it's advisable anymore to go to the local coffee shop, to go to a restaurant, to get on board a train, to ride an aircraft. We have to restore confidence that all of those things can be safely done again. And maybe it'll look different for a little while, but those differences are part of the confidence building measures that over time will ensure that we begin to approach the level of economic activity we had before. We've learned a great deal about some reliance in supply chains on overseas suppliers that really revealed how much we have moved away from domestic manufacturing of some commodities, some protective devices that prove vital here in this pandemic. And so as the federal government is looking to invest in the future, we're hoping that there's some incentivization to building domestic capacity, make it attractive to manufacture these devices that we've learned are of such pressing need in the U.S. We have an unbeatable logistics system, whether it's rail, aircraft for moving cargo and people, trucking for moving cargo. We have a logistics system that's the envy of the world. Often we criticize it. We say the roadways aren't good enough, and yes, they can be better, or we wish we had more of this or more of that. And that gets back to the American dream. We're always looking for opportunities to get better. But when I have visitors that come to us from China, from Russia, and they're asking questions as to how is it we can move cargo by rail more cheaply than they can, when we have a very well-paid workforce that makes money that is beyond the imagination of the equivalent rail workers in their countries, and we're able to move more efficiently than they can at lower cost, that tells me that our logistics system is the envy of the world. Well, we got to make sure that some of what has been manufactured overseas, some of what's proved vitally necessary here in the past several months, that there's an opportunity for those materials to be here. And then getting down to the two key areas from our vantage, and there's been some good discussion on this webinar thus far on lessons learned. We're doing the same thing. We're looking back at what we have done in managing a series of incidents. And just go back to January and look at what we had to deal with in both government and the private sector. We had the killing of the Quds Force commander in Iran, which led to all sorts of concerns about physical and cyber threats emanating from the Iranian government. In the rail industry, we had very strategically placed blockades of rail operations in Canada by groups opposing construction of a pipeline in British Columbia. That had effects not just in Canada, but on traffic from the U.S. into Canada. We then moved into COVID-19 and all of its effects. And then more recently, we've had the demonstrations and some of the disruptions that's caused to industries across the board, to include some surface transportation operations also. And here just in the past few days, we had a tropical storm come ashore in New Orleans, which is a reminder that we're now in hurricane season and the disruptive effects that those entail. So in our industry, we're looking at, each year we have a very vibrant security exercise. It involves a lot of different scenarios in physical and cybersecurity, all going on at the same time. And over about a 5-hour period, there may be a dozen different types of scenarios playing out. And we've often looked at that and thought, that's unrealistic. We'll never have to face a situation like that. We're managing so many incidents at the same time. But we've gone through a stretch of time here in the first part of 2020 where you could make the case that we've had the rough equivalent of one of these very challenging AAR-driven exercises in the rail industry. In fact, some of our members have said, we feel like we've been on one of those AAR exercises that take so much effort here now for the past few months. So instead of having the same exercise, same type of approach you've had before, this year we're going to look back. Go back to January, look through these series of incidents. What have we learned about what worked well and how we operate as an industry? What did we learn where the gaps are, where the opportunities are to improve? And so our focus now is, let's look at the lessons learned and let's define opportunities for improvement. What can we do within our industry? What can we do in partnership with government? And that leads to the last point. We often talk in terms of a whole of community response. As we go into hurricane season, you always talk about, okay, as a major hurricane comes ashore, one of the whole of community response, particularly in the aftermath, to help the states affected by the storm to respond and recover. But far too often, the whole of community doesn't apply really to the whole of community. For those who have done this work in emergency preparedness and response, you've often heard the refrain on DHS and FEMA calls that when you're asking about help and getting access to areas placed under restriction or control by local authorities, the direction is, well, that's a state level concern. Well, for COVID-19, we didn't leave it as a state level concern. Yes, the states maintain responsibility. Yes, the states maintain jurisdiction. But the states were very well guided by this guidance that came out from CISA on essential critical infrastructure workers. And that guidance didn't just say who those workers were, what categories of jobs they were doing. It also talked in terms of how that guidance should be used to ensure those workers had the fullest opportunity to continue to do their jobs, to keep economies going, so that we weren't aggravating the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 restrictions by economic disruptions resulting from inordinate blocks to workers trying to do their jobs. Well, the terms of that guidance only apply to COVID-19. Well, we've already raised in the rail industry, what are we doing at DHS to apply that more broadly? Haven't we set a precedent? And isn't that precedent that, yes, there are categories of essential workers, and those essential workers should be exempt from this range of restrictions that come up in the various types of emergencies we face, not just the pandemic, but hurricane response, tropical storm response, response to other forms of natural disasters or intentional incidents. So we're also looking in terms of, let's make sure we don't forget what worked well with this pandemic and just table it and say that was for COVID-19. What we've learned from responding to COVID-19 has practical application to a range of emergency situations.
Thanks, Tom. And that's the perfect note on which to end. I'd like to thank Alex, Tom, and Dan for being panelists today. I really appreciate you being here. And I want to ask the listeners to be sure you've checked the chat. If you haven't yet already, there's been some good discussion, especially around the CRA, which is the commercial routing app. That's especially helpful for this community. A link to that. And I encourage you to check it out. Anne, thank you so much for posting that. So also a reminder that to please post your questions in either the chat or the Q&A function of Zoom, and we should have a few minutes to get to those. In the meantime, Tom, I'd love to pass it to you for some closing comments.
Okay. Great discussion. Like I said, this can go on quite a bit. It's fascinating. Every time I listen, I'm learning some of this. We're going to stick around for a few minutes and answer some questions. We cannot have Tom Farmer join us without a baseball story, so always one of my favorite highlights. And if you're wondering what garb he's wearing, well, he'll tell you if you hang on for a minute. We invite you guys to register for the SICE. We're planning a number of these types of cross-sector operational, quote-unquote, discussions. And really the big idea here is to, how do we learn from the past and not repeat it in the future, right? That's the whole reason we're doing this, is to capture these so we can share that out with the group. So thank you all for attending. And Laura, I'll turn it back to you. We can do some Q&A. I've got a couple myself. And but maybe before we do, Tom can, if he has something to share from baseball standpoint, especially his hat, I thought was great.
All right. Well, thank you for that. As Tom Moran can attest for the group, I often use baseball analogies in my discussions. I do think that most complex problems can be more readily understood by comparison to events on baseball. The cap and the shirt that goes with it is, if you're familiar with the baseball movie, The Natural from 1984. Robert Redford plays this ball player who has a very promising young career. He gets gunned down by a deranged fan, and his life takes a vastly different direction for 17 years. But late in life, about 37 years old, he gets this opportunity to play again for a team called the New York Knights, a fictional team roughly modeled on the New York Giants National League Baseball team in 1939. Very entertaining movie. I have the jersey, the hat, the road jersey, the sweatshirt, the jacket. So my wife is taking very good care of me and making sure I'm a good representative of not just talking about baseball, but being able to walk it and present it in a forum like this. So Tom, thanks for that opportunity.
All right. I'm going to get to a question from Rod Edsel, because not only has he chatted it, he put it in the Q&A. So I know he really wants to have this answered. And for those of you still listening on the line, kudos to Rob, because him and his team were the creators of the CRA tool that I just mentioned. And they're with Idaho National Lab, and they did that with support of DHS. So Rob, happy to have you on. His question is, you all have talked about partnering with DHS. On the federal level, what things have you turned to DOT for?
Laura, I'm happy to
yeah, Alex, I was just going to point that to you.
And I preface this by saying, you know,
Dan. Okay, sorry, Dan.
Yeah, no worries. I would qualify FMCSA under, you know, DOT. Obviously, that's part of US DOT. I mean, as far as working with folks at DOT directly, I know early on, again, we work with members of DOT as far as some messaging goes. We dealt with them with the New York City issue with the quarantine restrictions. But then even working with the USD through an effort to recognize truck drivers. We had trucks on a White House lawn where President Trump honored drivers in a public event. So DOT was critical with the image campaign kind of throughout the process that we were able to work with them on. But certainly FMCSA would fall into that mix in our constant communication that we have with them throughout the whole process.
Okay, thanks so much, Dan. Trying to scan. I'm just scanning to see if there.
Can I answer that?
Yeah. Or is that Tom? Sorry, Tom. Go ahead.
Tom. Yeah. Again, I think this implicates this concept of the maturing of the GCC SCC framework. The DOT, when it was structured after 9/11, it seemed very much focused on a terrorism security mission, and so often TSA has been the effective lead. But this virus response, I think, really brought DOT to the fore as a very effective partner in this unified government industry position we were able to take to DHS, CISA, and the FEMA. DOT has really stepped up, particularly their intelligence, security, and emergency response group at the headquarters, and in our case, the Director of Security. So Amy Calsbeek and Rick Huggins in particular have been very instrumental in crafting what are these joint government industry presentations. So it's applied as we've worked on identifying criminal social workers, on revising the content of the CISA guidance to be both more inclusive of workers as well as more clear in its application. The facial coverings initiative really was triggered by the support from DOT, and DOT was very instrumental in actually arranging for the shipments and the deliveries. So I think you've seen in this incident a real stepping forward at DOT and assuming a true co-sector specific agency role, whereas in the past, because of the early terrorism focus of the NIP, you've largely had TSA seen as in the lead. I want to give DOT a lot of credit. They've really worked cooperatively on these shared priorities and helped make a difference.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Tom. And those are all the written questions that we had. We had a couple of great comments, especially someone wrote, they're going to look for possible roles for fusion centers in all of this. So I thought that was pretty interesting. What I'd like to do is just unmute everybody, and anyone who wants to stay online can ask their questions or say hello. But first, I wanted to thank our panelists again for your participation today. Great discussion. Really appreciate your time and effort in putting this together. All Hazards Consortium puts on these discussions about weekly. Our next one is next Thursday on GIS. So we'll send out some marketing information on that. We invite you to attend. All these are free. And I also wanted to give you my email address, which is laura.johnson@ahcusa.org, in case you have any questions or follow-up. comments that you'd like to make, feel free to reach out. Tom?
Laura,
Yeah,
while you're unmuting everyone, I got a question for Alex and Dan and Tom. Looking back, it's a tough question we're wrestling with. Looking back, if you could pick one thing operationally that you learned from COVID that public and private could focus on, would be a big domino that could knock down a bunch of them. Off the top of your head, what would you say looking back? Dan, I'll start with you, and then Alex and Tom. What would you say one thing coming out of COVID you think would really move the ball if we could fix this, right? Or leverage what you learned going forward, right? We've been asking this question to a lot of people, and it's tough. It's a tough question because a lot of things happen, but wanted to just have you guys think about that. Because what happens many times is we got 50 things and everybody tries to work on one thing and nothing gets, you can't move the ball that much. But I was curious, Dan, from your perspective, what one thing from your perspective would, learning from COVID, that you could go forward with, what do you think that would, what comes to mind?
So on a broader perspective of potentially addressing other issues that were to come down the pike in the future, collaboration to me would be the big item that had we, trucking, and maybe rail, others, been involved in discussions from the start before the regulatory action happened or the state did whatever, we could have solved a lot of probably headaches before they ever happened. So collaboration, getting input of all sectors, that would include aviation, rail, highway, throughout the decision-making process, I think could help solve a lot of issues, or really avoid the issue from happening in the first place. Because again, as I said early on in the call, a lot of my first several weeks as a task force dealing with this was reaction to issues that had happened within the state level and dealing with, like I said, the CISA, New York City, Pennsylvania, to where we maybe had some input on the forefront, we could have avoided it to happen. And I'm not saying, we have this this power of saying, don't do that or do that. But in a lot of these cases where something had taken place, it merely was us providing input of here's why this is bad or here's why this has a negative impact, and it was fixed. So had we been able to provide that information early on, I think that could have solved a lot of issues. So I'd say my thing would be, collaboration going forward, avoiding those knee-jerk reactions of closing rest stops right from the start. Things along those lines that we could probably avoid from the start had there been more dialogue. And again, it was one of those learning actions that I would change going forward after we had to do this again.
Okay, so if I could paraphrase, is there a plan or would it be a mechanism to maybe capture those operational impacts of these policy choices and give that to states? A lot of times states didn't have time to know really. Who could plan, right?
Yeah.
But maybe something that could provide states, hey, when you did this, here's how it impacted us. Something like that?
Certainly, absolutely.
Okay.
Giving
Alex?
that overall impact and not just, Dan Horvath sitting in an office saying, here's why I don't like this, but here is the driver that didn't have a place to stop, or here is the driver that was denied delivering the shipment because he was in New York City 10 days previously.
Well, and it's interesting you say that because in this specific event, you had the state health departments were playing key roles in this, right? That doesn't happen that often, right? Yeah. Then you have state police and transportation doing the transportation. Then you had emergency management. I mean, this was a big furball for a lot of states, and they just I don't think they had eyes and ears into the impacts, but they want to know that. They want to know those impacts, so that will inform decision makers next time. Great, thank you. Alex, how about from your perspective?
I think I can speak from the government perspective, and being part of the task force, one of our members is on the White House task force. So what they brought back to the department every day was shared, and we worked on it. I think public relations, I think it built a strong partnership that we might not have completely with all the states and industry partners. Guys like Dan, Tom, and I, we know what happens in the regular business day of being a truck driver or driving the train and this and that. But I think for a lot of the states, realizing that, these state governors and these state politicians realize, you know what, the trucking industry really does a lot more than it looks like. I think we saw that in New York City with the quarantine, where we had drivers says, I'm not going in there. And then all of a sudden it became a crisis. Now, after any hurricane, obviously stores and the communities close down for a week or two usually, and they start recovery process. But this went on for over probably 150 days, if you really look at, or will go on. And so it really started back in early March and going forth. And I think it brought a lot of, from a DOT perspective, it really made us look more pro-business. We really wanted to get out and try to get out ahead of it to say, listen, let's not tie people's hands. Let them do what they need to do. Let them deliver groceries. That's what the American people want. That's what we need, and so forth. And now I think with the pictures at the White House and the White House administration focusing on the trucks and this and that, I think it really opened up a lot of areas to where people are now saying, you know what, that's important. And for another example was the closure of the rest stops. Pennsylvania was the first one. We're going to close 37 rest stops. And then all of a sudden we went back saying, listen, you close these rest stops, these truck drivers don't want to come here. They can't drive around the clock. They got to pull off on the side of the road. And so then they said, you know what, you're right. We never thought about that. So I think it opened up a lot. Now, I would say the takeaway, and hopefully it will continue, is the importance of the American trucker, the American bus operator, the people in the transportation to deliver our goods each and every day to the grocery stores and to the grade schools, delivering milk to the elementary schools. All those things are very important. They're all done by commercial trucks and buses and so forth. That's all I have.
Alex, I would say what you said is underscored, and now I believe probably every American citizen trying to find toilet paper understands what that means now.
By all means.
I can't imagine. I know a family, or any of you know a family, that didn't experience some type of shortage on something, right? And you're right. Tom Farmer, how about from your perspective? Maybe, I know there's got to be a million things, but if you had to pick one.
Well, let me, I'll indulge you with a bit of a baseball analogy. So if you're familiar with Tom Boswell, he's a senior baseball writer for the Washington Post. Been doing the job for 50 years.
Long time.
And like any expert, he had his starts at a much lower level. He was a beat reporter for the Baltimore Orioles in the late 60s. And he tells a story where he's interviewing the Orioles manager, Earl Weaver, at the time. And if you remember Earl Weaver, the little guy, very fiery, renowned for getting thrown out of games. He's sitting in a dugout. He's got his cigarette going, and Boswell's interviewing him. And suddenly in the background, Boswell hears the national anthem being played. And he feels like he's overstepped his bounds. So he says to the manager, he says to Earl Weaver, "Oh, please, sir, excuse me. I didn't mean to stick around this long." And Weaver looks at him and he says, "Relax, kid. We do this every day." Now, you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with why we're assembled this afternoon? With these coordinating councils, SCCs, GCCs, Critical Infrastructure Coordinating Council, All Hazards Consortium, we have assembled the people who do this every day. Too often, though, we wait until the problems start to tap the expertise and the experience of those who do it every day. I mean, Dan just made a very good point. Early discussion of, the term I often hear on the DHS calls is a very good one, but it's often not honored with action on it. They talk about issue spotting. Well, there were many issues that were spotted as potentially problematic before they became problems in these recurring conference calls. If we're going to bring this talent together, if we're going to invite these participants with all the expertise they bring to bear, then I think we have an incumbent responsibility to ensure that we are listening at an early stage. There was nothing that happened with the blocks to worker access because of these local orders that wasn't raised in one or more industries beforehand, on a phone call, in a written request for information. And so we were primed to explain, and we're explaining, here's what's going to happen if some of these blocks are interpreted in a way that is preventing workers from doing their jobs. So again, I think we've made some good points this afternoon, but the bottom line is, when you bring this caliber of talent together, you got to tap it. And you don't wait for the problems to start. You help them, allow you to anticipate the problems and prevent them from happening in the first place.
Great point. Laura, I guess we've got everybody who's sticking around.
Yeah.
Open mic.
Yeah. If anyone wants to unmute their phone and just say hello to our panelists or let us know where you're from, now's the chance before we disconnect. We'd love to hear from you. They're quiet today, Tom.
They are quiet.
Okay.
I will, I'll extend an invitation, Tom, to you and Alex and Dan. The states that we work with want to explore an operational feedback loop, anonymous, right? So there's no, but they want to know, hey, when we closed bars and restaurants, what was the operational impact? So they took 9 actions, right? This is the state emergency managers, right? They took 9 actions, and which ones really prohibited commerce? That was the trick, commerce, right? Movement or commerce. They want to do that, and they want to develop that and get that out for like a ongoing feedback for COVID-1, COVID-2, hurricane, wildfire, whatever. So I'll invite you guys into that discussion. It's a fantastic idea, but the states didn't know, Dan. They didn't really know who could prepare for this, right? They wanted to stop the spread and save lives and the cascading impacts no one could plan for. But now that we've been through it, to Tom's point, now that we've been through it, let's go back and see how can we better coordinate before it hits the fan the next time, right? So I really appreciate you guys bringing that up. I think it's great.
And Tom, if I could, that point's well taken. You know, it was interesting. We got some pushback. We were a proponent in the rail industry of including hotel and motel workers as essential. And people said, well, what are you advocating for that for? I said, well, our crews work in remote areas, and we have to change train crews at odd hours of the night and day, and they have to go into crew rest. So they need these local places that you're saying should close down. They need to be able to go to these places and get that rest. If they can't, we can't operate. And I think truckers are in a similar situation. So it was interesting. We were advocating very strongly for what was in something, it was in the commercial facility sector. And so we got some pushback. We said, wait a minute, if you don't include them, you're undercutting industry's ability to make sure their crews get necessary rest to continue their operations the next day.
To that point, I mean, on the hotel front, the same thing with our guys. I remember making a comment of hotels closing is impacting our drivers, and the response was, I thought the drivers sleep in the truck. To which point we then had to explain that that's one segment of trucking where you have a sleeper, but for day drivers that might be stuck here and there, they need a hotel. They don't have a bunk. So yeah, that was a great point there, and it's something that we had to push for. It was education. I mean, you can't blame the person for not understanding every aspect of whether trucking or rail or that, but educating and explaining, hey, here's why this matters. Here's the impact.
And this is a great point, because just when the states get it figured out, there's an election.
That's true.
I've been through a ton in my 16 years. And so it's finding these councils, right? Where people can leave private and go to government or vice versa. It's finding these networks, the brain trust can be preserved, because otherwise we start all over again. A new person comes in, you know, what's AAR? You know, what's ATA? You know, they got to start from scratch. Not that they're ignorant. It's just there's so much to learn, right? So the beauty of these networks of people, people might move around, but they're still trusted agents. And so I love the hotel example, because people just, what do you think these people live in their trucks, right? That's what everybody thinks. Oh, God. You better buy a bunch of tents, because if you don't have hotels, you're not going to have toilet paper.
Hey, Tom, we had a raised hand from Deb Matherly. How's it going, Deb?
Hi, good to talk with you. I wanted to thank you all for wonderful presentations. I'm currently working on Transportation Research Board project on emergency playbook, and we're developing an emergency playbook for transportation related to pandemic. I'm sorry. And so I'd like to be able to reach out to you in the next, to some of you, and have maybe some follow-up conversations on this, because the questions you asked were great, the kinds of things that we want to ask emergency managers, the Department of Transportation emergency managers and all that, but some of the lessons you have in here are just perfect. So I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart. This has been wonderful.
Thanks, Deb. Who are you with, Deb?
You're very welcome.
Oh, I'm with WSP. I'm doing the research for the Transportation Research Board, Stefan Parker. So.
Right. Okay.
Deb, I just think we're getting warmed up.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's full stride yet, but no, this is great. I'm glad you're on the call. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, Tom, I think it's time to adjourn. I just want to say thanks again to our panelists. You all hit a home run. Tom, that one's for you if you didn't get the. And thanks to all of our listeners. We hope to see you at the next one. In the meantime, stay safe.
Right.
Bye, guys.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Safe.
Take care.